Tonight, we examine a case that once commanded national attention and then became part of British legal history. A single investigation, a single verdict, and a legacy that has endured for more than a century. The case of Mary Emsley begins in Stepney, in the East End of London, in the summer of 1860. London at this date was the largest city in the world, its population exceeding 2.5 million residents, and its eastern districts were expanding rapidly to accommodate the labouring families drawn to the docks, the railways, and the small trades that supported them. Stepney and the adjoining district of Mile End Old Town had, over the preceding 3 decades, been built up street by street with rows of modest terraced houses, constructed quickly and let out at weekly or monthly rents to clerks, artisans, dock workers, and their families. The housing stock was uniform in character: narrow brick fronts, small yards, shared walls, and it was this housing stock, multiplied across dozens of streets, that formed the basis of a substantial private fortune for at least one resident of the area. Grove Road, where the case centres, ran through this same landscape of terraced dwellings, indistinguishable in outward appearance from the houses let to tenants throughout the surrounding streets. The East End of 1860 was a district of contrasts, containing both grinding poverty among casual dock labourers and, less visibly, considerable private wealth accumulated by landlords who owned and let the very houses their poorer neighbours occupied. Policing in this period remained comparatively rudimentary. The Metropolitan Police had existed for just over 3 decades, and detective capability within the force was still in its early stages of development, reliant on local knowledge, informants, and the cooperation of residents rather than the forensic and investigative methods that would characterise later decades. A crime committed within a private residence, discovered only after some delay, presented particular difficulties for investigators working with the tools available at the time. It was within this setting, a district of rented terraces and modest respectability, that Mary Emsley lived and conducted her business. She was, by the account of contemporaries and later historians alike, one of the wealthiest residents of the district, though her manner of living gave little outward indication of this fact. She owned a substantial number of houses across Stepney and the neighbouring parish of Bethnal Green, properties she had acquired and retained over a period of years as a widow managing her own affairs. Rather than employ an agent or a rent collector on a permanent basis, she was known to visit her properties personally, walking from street to street to collect rents directly from her tenants, a practice that brought her into regular and repeated contact with a wide range of local residents, tradesmen, and casual labourers whom she engaged from time to time for repairs and other work about her properties. The record available for this account does not establish Mary Emsley's maiden name, her place of birth, or the details of her early life prior to widowhood. She's understood to have been approximately 70 years of age at the time of the events described here, though a precise date of birth is not confirmed in the sources reviewed for this account. Her husband, from whom she appears to have inherited or built up the property holdings she managed in 1860, is likewise not identified by name in the surviving record consulted here. What can be stated with confidence is that by the summer of 1860 she was a widow of advanced age, living alone at 9 Grove Road, and personally overseeing a portfolio of rented houses that made her, in practical terms, a woman of considerable means, despite the plainness of her circumstances. Contemporary accounts consistently describe her as frugal in her personal habits, living in a manner that gave no outward sign of her financial position. She did not maintain the household staff that a woman of her wealth might have been expected to employ, and she continued into old age to conduct the physical work of collecting rents herself, rather than delegating the task to others on a permanent basis. This combination, considerable wealth held quietly, and a daily routine that took her on foot and unaccompanied through the streets, and houses of Stepney and Bethnal Green placed her in a position of some vulnerability, a fact that would become evident only in retrospect. The record consulted for this account does not establish with certainty whether she employed any domestic servant living within the house at 9 Grove Road, though the general character of her household, as described in contemporary sources, suggests she lived largely without such assistance. If value is found in cases such as this one, preserved through trial records, contemporary press accounts, and the testimony given before the court, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and note in the comments where the recording is being heard from. What follows begins in Stepney in the summer of 1860. Mary Emsley's routine in the weeks before her death followed the pattern she had maintained for years. She continued to visit her properties to collect rents, and she continued to engage local tradesmen for repair work as it was needed across her various houses. Among the men she had employed in this capacity was James Mullins, described in the sources reviewed as an odd job man and plasterer who had previously served as a policeman with the Irish Constabulary before turning to other trades. Mullins had performed work for Mary Emsley on more than one occasion, and he was known to her as a tradesman she called upon when repairs were required. A second man who featured in her business dealings was Walter M., sometimes recorded as Thomas M., who acted as a collector of rents and outstanding debts on her behalf. M., like Mullins, was a man in his 50s, and the sources reviewed do not indicate that he had any background in policing. His connection to Mary Emsley's affairs was limited to his work as a collector of rents and debts, and he is to be understood as an entirely distinct figure from Mullins, playing a very different role in the events that followed. Walter M.'s involvement in Mary Emsley's affairs was limited to his work collecting rents and debts on her behalf, and nothing in the record reviewed for this account suggests any wrongdoing on his part at any stage. The house at 9 Grove Road, where Mary Emsley lived, was of the same general type as the properties she owned and let elsewhere in the district, a terraced dwelling of modest outward appearance, giving no external indication of the wealth held by its occupant. She lived there alone, continuing her established pattern of collecting rents on foot and managing her financial affairs personally rather than through an agent or solicitor engaged on a continuing basis. On the evening of Monday, the 13th of August 1860, a neighbour observed her at the window of her bedroom at approximately 7 o'clock. This sighting would later be established as the last confirmed observation of Mary Emsley alive. She was not seen again by anyone able to give an account of her afterward. Her absence in the days that followed did not immediately prompt alarm. Given her solitary manner of living, and the fact that she was not in the habit of receiving regular visitors or maintaining a fixed daily schedule that others might have monitored, several days passed without her disappearance being remarked upon by those in the surrounding area. This circumstance, consistent with the pattern of her life, as a woman living alone and largely unaccompanied in her daily business, meant that whatever had occurred within the house at 9 Grove Road on or shortly after the evening of the 13th of August remained undiscovered for a period of days. It was not until the 17th of August 1860 that Mary Emsley's body was discovered within the house. The circumstances surrounding the discovery, including the identity of the person or persons who first entered the premises and the reason for their doing so, are not established with particularity in the sources reviewed for this account. What is established is that her body was found on the top floor of the house, and that she had died as the result of a severe blow or blows to the head. The injuries she had sustained were described in contemporary accounts as sufficient to have caused death rapidly, and the cause of her death was established as blunt force injury to the head. The physician or physicians who examined her remains are not named with certainty in the record consulted here, and the specific details of the examination are not addressed in the sources available for this account beyond the general finding as to cause of death. Near her body, a length of wallpaper rolled was found, though the sources reviewed do not establish with certainty what significance, if any, this item held in relation to the cause of her death or the circumstances of the attack. It may be noted that Mary Emsley, as the owner of numerous rented properties, might reasonably have kept materials of this kind about her house in connection with the maintenance of her holdings, and the presence of the wallpaper should not be understood as necessarily bearing upon the attack itself. A bloody footprint was also found upon the floorboards of the room in which she was discovered. No witness has been identified in the sources reviewed who observed the attack itself and the precise sequence of events within the house on the evening of the 13th of August, or in the days that followed before her body was found, is not established with certainty by the record consulted for this account. The discovery of Mary Emsley's body on the 17th of August 1860 brought the matter immediately to the attention of the police. Given her standing within the district as a woman of substantial property and the manner of her death, the case attracted prompt official attention, and a formal investigation was opened without delay. A reward was offered for information leading to the identification of the person or persons responsible, a standard practice in cases of this severity during the period, intended to encourage residents of the district who might possess relevant knowledge to come forward to the authorities. The investigation proceeded on the understanding that the person responsible for Mary Emsley's death was likely to have been known to her, given the nature of her routine and the absence of any indication of forced entry noted in the sources reviewed. Officers assigned to the investigation began the process of establishing Mary Emsley's recent movements and associations, a task made more complicated by the several days that had elapsed between the last confirmed sighting of her and the discovery of her body. Her tenants and neighbours and the various tradesmen and collectors she had engaged in the course of her business were among those whose accounts were sought as the investigation proceeded. Among those questioned in connection with her affairs was James Mullins, the odd job man and plasterer who had previously performed work for her. It was in the course of this early stage of the investigation that Mullins came forward with information that would substantially alter the direction of the inquiry. Mullins reported to the police that he had observed Walter M. placing a parcel within a shed located on M's own premises. He described the parcel as connected in some manner to Mary Emsley's affairs, and he directed officers to the precise location within the shed where it could be found. Acting upon this information, officers searched the shed identified by Mullins and recovered a parcel containing items linked to Mary Emsley. On the strength of this discovery, suspicion initially fell upon Walter M., whose premises had yielded the parcel, and whose position as a collector of rents and debts on Mary Emsley's behalf placed him in regular contact with her affairs. However, as the investigation proceeded further, officers began to examine more closely the precision with which Mullins had directed them to the parcel's location. Mullins had not merely suggested that a search of M's premises might prove productive. He had specified the exact place within the shed where the parcel would be found, a level of detail that investigators came to regard as difficult to reconcile with an account of having merely observed M's actions from a distance on some earlier occasion. The question that emerged from this scrutiny was how Mullins had come to possess such precise knowledge of the parcel's location if his role in the matter had been limited to that of an observer rather than a participant. No satisfactory, innocent explanation for this precision was established in the course of the investigation, and suspicion accordingly began to shift from Walter M. toward James Mullins himself, on the theory that Mullins had placed the parcel in the shed personally in order to direct suspicion toward M and thereby distance himself from the crime while simultaneously positioning himself to claim the reward that had been offered. As this line of inquiry developed, officers turned their attention more directly toward Mullins' own recent movements and his prior association with Mary Emsley through the repair work he had performed for her over time. His knowledge of her house, her routine, and the general management of her properties, acquired through his work as a tradesman in her employ was considered in relation to the circumstances of her death. The investigation established that Mullins had, in the period preceding the discovery of the parcel, possessed both the opportunity arising from his familiarity with her affairs and, on the theory now being pursued by investigators, a motive connected to the reward offered for information and to a desire to deflect suspicion from himself onto another party. On the basis of this developing case, James Mullins was arrested and charged with the willful murder of Mary Emsley, and Walter M., the man he had first implicated, was cleared of suspicion in the matter. The examination of Mary Emsley's remains was conducted in the days following the discovery of her body, and the findings were entered into the record ahead of the coroner's proceedings that would follow. The examining physician, whose name is not established with certainty in the sources reviewed for this account, determined that death had resulted from severe injury to the head, consistent with one or more heavy blows delivered with considerable force. The injuries were described as sufficient to have caused death within a short period, and no other significant contributing cause was noted in the findings available for this account. The examination did not, according to the sources reviewed, establish any evidence of a prolonged struggle within the room in which she was found, beyond the single bloody footprint already noted upon the floorboards. Of particular note in the findings, and a matter that would assume considerable importance as the case proceeded toward trial, was the absence of blood upon the person or clothing of the man subsequently charged with her murder. Given the severity of the injuries described and the quantity of blood that would be expected to result from an attack of this nature, the examining authorities and later those who reviewed the case regarded this absence as a circumstance requiring explanation. No satisfactory account of this absence was produced in the course of the proceedings that followed, and it remained one of the central points of contention in the case as it moved from investigation toward trial. A coroner's inquest was convened in accordance with the standard procedure of the period to inquire formally into the cause and circumstances of Mary Emsley's death. The specific venue of the inquest and the name of the presiding coroner are not established with certainty in the sources reviewed for this account. The inquest proceeded on the basis of the medical findings already established, together with such evidence as had been gathered by the police in the course of their investigation up to that point, including the account given by James Mullins regarding the parcel discovered at Walter M.'s premises and the subsequent redirection of suspicion toward Mullins himself. The jury at the inquest returned a finding consistent with the case being pursued against Mullins, and the matter proceeded toward committal for trial at the Old Bailey. The committal proceedings that preceded the trial, at which a magistrate would have reviewed the evidence gathered by the police and determined whether it was sufficient to send James Mullins forward for trial on the charge of willful murder, are not described in particular detail in the sources reviewed for this account. What is established is that Mullins was in due course committed for trial at the Central Criminal Court, commonly known as the Old Bailey, on the charge of having willfully murdered Mary Emsley, and that he remained in custody in the period between his arrest and the commencement of the trial. The trial of James Mullins opened at the Old Bailey on the 22nd of October 1860, the names of the presiding judge and of the counsel appearing for the prosecution and the defence are not established with certainty in the sources reviewed for this account. The prosecution's case rested substantially on the circumstantial evidence surrounding the parcel discovered at Walter M.'s premises, and in particular upon the precision with which Mullins had directed police to its exact location within the shed. This precision was presented to the jury as evidence that Mullins himself had placed the parcel there in an effort to divert suspicion toward M, and that his knowledge of its location could not reasonably be explained on any innocent basis consistent with his account of having merely observed M at a distance on some earlier occasion. The prosecution further drew upon Mullins's prior association with Mary Emsley through the repair work he had performed for her, presenting this familiarity with her household and her habits as consistent with the opportunity required to carry out the attack upon her. The defence, for its part, is understood from the sources reviewed to have pointed to the absence of any blood found upon Mullins or his clothing, a circumstance difficult to reconcile with his having delivered the blows that caused Mary Emsley's death, given the severity of those injuries as established by the medical examination. No confession was produced by the prosecution, and Mullins himself gave no account during the proceedings, admitting to the killing, maintaining instead his position that the parcel had been placed by M, and that he had done no more than report what he had seen. The trial proceeded over the course of the day, with the evidence gathered by the police during the investigation presented before the court in the sequence in which it had been developed, beginning with the discovery of the body, followed by the medical findings as to cause of death, and concluding with the account of the parcel and the redirection of suspicion from M toward Mullins. The jury, having heard the evidence presented by both the prosecution and the defence, retired to consider their verdict. After a period of deliberation reported to have lasted approximately 3 hours, the jury returned to the courtroom and delivered a verdict of guilty against James Mullins on the charge of the willful murder of Mary Emsley. Upon the return of the guilty verdict, the court proceeded to sentencing without delay, murder at this date carrying a mandatory sentence upon conviction. The presiding judge pronounced sentence of death upon James Mullins to be carried out in the customary manner. Mullins received the sentence without, according to the sources reviewed, offering any further statement at that time beyond his continued assertion of innocence with respect to the killing itself, though he did not withdraw his account concerning the parcel and Walter M. The verdict and sentence were reported extensively in the press in the days that followed, the case having already attracted considerable public attention on account of Mary Emsley's standing as a woman of substantial property within the district, and the trial's conclusion did nothing to diminish the degree of public interest the case continued to command. In the period between the conclusion of the trial and the date fixed for his execution, James Mullins remained in custody, and no successful application for reprieve is recorded in the sources reviewed for this account. Whether a formal petition seeking clemency was submitted to the Home Secretary on his behalf is not established with certainty in the record consulted here, though cases of this character, resting substantially on circumstantial evidence, not infrequently attracted such petitions during this period. What is established is that no reprieve was granted, and the sentence of death pronounced at the conclusion of the trial stood to be carried out as scheduled. James Mullins was executed by hanging outside Newgate Jail on the 19th of November 1860. On the morning of his execution, he gave a final statement to an alderman present at the prison, in which he continued to protest his innocence of the crime for which he was to be put to death. He described his conviction, in the words recorded from that statement, as resting upon what he termed the most false and gross perjury that was ever given in a court of justice. He made no confession to the killing of Mary Emsley at any point before his execution was carried out, and he offered no account of the crime itself beyond his continued assertion that the evidence presented against him had been false. The specific arrangements of the execution, including the identity of the executioner, are not established with certainty in the sources reviewed for this account. The verdict returned against James Mullins, and the sentence subsequently carried out, did not settle the question of his guilt to the satisfaction of all who examined the case in the years that followed. The conviction rested substantially upon circumstantial evidence, centred on the discovery of the parcel at Walter M.'s premises and the precision with which Mullins had directed officers to its location, a precision the prosecution had presented to the jury as proof that Mullins himself had placed it there. No physical evidence directly connecting Mullins to the act of violence itself was produced at trial, and the absence of blood upon his person or clothing despite the severity of the injuries Mary Emsley had sustained, remained unexplained by the prosecution's case and unaddressed by any statement Mullins himself offered before his execution. Decades after the trial and execution had concluded, the case was taken up by the author Arthur Conan Doyle, who examined the surviving record in an essay titled The Debatable Case of Mrs. Emsley, published in the Strand magazine and later collected among his writings on notable criminal cases. Conan Doyle, reviewing the evidence presented at the Old Bailey in October of 1860, did not treat the conviction of James Mullins as a settled or safe conclusion to the matter. He gave particular weight to the absence of blood upon Mullins, despite the nature of the fatal injuries, and to the fact that Mullins, even facing execution, offered no confession and no account of the killing itself, maintaining instead his consistent position regarding the parcel and Walter M. Conan Doyle's essay treated the case as one that had not, in his assessment, been conclusively resolved by the verdict returned at trial, notwithstanding that a man had been convicted and hanged for the crime. The case has continued to attract attention among writers examining notable criminal trials of the Victorian period. A modern book-length study of the case, written by Sinclair Mackay and titled The Mile End Murder, subtitled The Case Conan Doyle Couldn't Solve, examines the trial, the surrounding investigation, and the questions that Conan Doyle had raised regarding the safety of the conviction. Contemporary material from the period of the trial and execution survives as well, including broadsides printed and sold at the time, among them one titled The Stepney Murder, describing the apprehension and examination of the man suspected of Mary Emsley's killing, copies of which are preserved among collections of English crime and execution broadsides held by research institutions. Newspaper coverage from 1860 itself was extensive, the case having drawn national attention on account of Mary Emsley's standing as a woman of considerable, if quietly held, wealth, and on account of the manner of her death within her own home. No formal pardon has been issued in the case of James Mullins, and no legal reversal of his conviction has occurred in the period since his execution. The doubts raised by Conan Doyle, and examined further in the modern study by Sinclair Mackay, remain historical rather than legal in character, a matter of continued scholarly and popular interest, rather than a matter that has been revisited by any court. Whether Mullins was in fact guilty of the killing, whether he acted to shield some other person from suspicion, or whether he was himself the victim of circumstances that pointed wrongly toward his guilt, remains a question that the surviving record does not resolve. The case has not produced any change in law or policy, but it has persisted through Conan Doyle's essay and through subsequent examination, as one of the notable instances in which the safety of a Victorian capital conviction has been seriously and repeatedly questioned by those who have studied it. The full record of the trial survives among the proceedings of the Old Bailey, catalogued under the reference assigned to the case of James Mullins, tried on the 22nd of October 1860 for the killing of Mary Emsley. Together with the contemporary press coverage and the surviving broadside material, this record has allowed successive generations of historians and writers to return to the case and to weigh the evidence presented at trial against the account given by Mullins himself in the days before his execution. The district in which Mary Emsley lived and worked, collecting her rents on foot among the terraced houses of Stepney and Bethnal Green, has long since been transformed by subsequent development, but the case itself, preserved in the trial record, the press accounts, and the broadsides sold on the streets of London in the autumn of 1860, has remained part of the historical account of criminal justice in that period, a case in which a verdict was returned, a sentence was carried out, and yet the question of guilt was never, in the judgment of those who examined it afterward, placed beyond doubt. The social conditions that shaped both Mary Emsley's position and the investigation into her death were particular to the East End of London at this stage of the city's growth. property ownership of the kind she held, a portfolio of terraced houses acquired and managed across her lifetime, as a widow acting independently in matters of business, was not common among women of her generation, the greater part of whom held property, where they held it at all, through the mediation of a husband, a trustee, or a male relative acting on their behalf. Mary Emsley's position, managing her own holdings directly, collecting her own rents, and engaging her own tradesmen without an intermediary, placed her outside the more usual pattern, and it was precisely this independence of management that had brought her into direct and repeated contact with the men later drawn into the investigation of her death. The reward system employed by the police in cases of this kind, offering a sum of money for information leading to the identification of a suspect, was a standard instrument of investigation during a period in which the detective branch of the Metropolitan Police remained limited in its resources and its methods. Such rewards were intended to draw forward those within a community who might possess relevant knowledge, but who might otherwise have no occasion or no inclination to bring that knowledge to the attention of the authorities. In the case of Mary Emsley's death, the offer of a reward is understood to have been a contributing factor in James Mullins's decision to come forward with his account concerning Walter M., a decision that, as the investigation subsequently established, appears to have been intended not to assist the police, but to direct their attention away from himself. The newspapers of London and of the wider country gave considerable space to the case throughout the autumn of 1860, from the discovery of the body in August through the trial in October and the execution in November. Reporting of this kind, covering the investigation, the trial, and the execution of a convicted murderer in close and continuing detail, was a well-established feature of the periodical press during this period, and cases involving a victim of some local prominence, as Mary Emsley was within Stepney and the surrounding district, tended to receive particularly sustained coverage. The broadsides sold on the streets in connection with the case, printed cheaply and distributed widely at the time of the trial and execution, represented a further and distinct form through which the case reached a wide public audience beyond the readership of the established newspapers, reaching those residents of London who might not otherwise have had regular access to printed news of the case as it developed. The house at 9 Grove Road itself, and the surrounding streets of terraced housing that Mary Emsley had built up as her holdings over the years of her widowhood, remained for a period afterward a point of local notoriety within the district, a physical reminder of the case that had unfolded within it. The pattern of her daily movements, walking from house to house among her tenants to collect rents in person rather than delegating the task, was itself remarked upon repeatedly in the accounts of the case that followed, understood by those who examined it afterward as a habit that had placed her week after week in the company of men whose characters and intentions she had no particular means of verifying beyond her own long acquaintance with them through the ordinary business of property management in a district built, street by street, upon exactly this kind of arrangement between a landlord and the tradesman engaged to maintain her properties. The scale of Mary Emsley's holdings, as later accounts of the case describe it, extended to a considerable number of individual houses spread across the streets of Stepney and Bethnal Green, sufficient in aggregate to have made her, by the standards of the district, an unusually substantial holder of residential property for a woman managing her affairs alone. Rents on houses of this kind in the East End during this period were typically collected on a weekly basis, in small sums, from tenants whose own incomes derived from casual and semi-skilled labour connected to the docks, the local workshops, and the general trades of the district. The task of collecting such sums from a large number of separate households required regular, repeated visits, street by street, a task that occupied a considerable portion of Mary Emsley's time, and that brought her, week upon week, into direct personal contact with a wide circle of tenants and tradesmen whose individual circumstances and reputation she came to know through long acquaintance rather than through any formal system of inquiry or reference. The streets of Bethnal Green and Stepney, through which she walked in the course of this work, were narrow and closely built. The houses set in continuous terraces, broken only by the occasional public house, small shop or chapel serving the surrounding population. The physical texture of the district, its brick fronts blackened by coal smoke, its narrow pavements, its close proximity of dwelling to dwelling, was characteristic of East End housing development throughout this period, land having been built upon quickly and at density to meet the demand created by London's continuing growth. It was within this dense and closely observed environment that a woman of Mary Emsley's means could nonetheless move largely unremarked. Her wealth known to those with whom she conducted business, but not otherwise conspicuous within a district where visible signs of prosperity were, in her own case, deliberately absent from her dress, her habits, and the outward condition of her own residence at Grove Road. The trial itself, conducted at the Old Bailey in October of 1860, took place before a courtroom whose public gallery was, according to accounts of major criminal proceedings of the period, generally filled to capacity in cases that had attracted the degree of public interest that Mary Emsley's death had generated. The Central Criminal Court at this date occupied premises adjoining Newgate Jail itself, the same institution within whose walls James Mullins would, within a matter of weeks, be confined pending his execution. Members of the public seeking admission to notable trials of this kind were required to obtain places within the gallery, often arriving well in advance of the court's sitting in order to secure a view of proceedings that were understood, from the earliest reports of the case in August, to bear upon a killing that had already drawn wide attention on account of the victims standing within her own district. The physical setting of the Old Bailey itself, with its raised bench for the presiding judge, its separate dock for the prisoner, and its rows of seating for counsel, jury, and members of the press, provided the formal stage upon which the evidence gathered across the preceding weeks. The discovery of the parcel, the precision of Mullins' directions to its hiding place, and the medical findings regarding the cause of Mary Emsley's death was presented in sequence before 12 jurors drawn, as was customary, from among the propertied men of the city, qualified to serve in that capacity. Reporters present within the courtroom transmitted accounts of the proceedings to their respective newspapers for publication in the days immediately following, allowing readers across London and beyond to follow the presentation of evidence in something close to its original sequence, a practice that contributed significantly to the sustained public interest. The case continued to command, through the week separating the trial from the execution that followed it in November. The execution itself, carried out outside Newgate on the morning of the 19th of November, took place before a further public gathering, public hanging remaining, at this date, an event conducted in the open and attended by members of the public who assembled outside the prison walls in the hours before the appointed time. Public executions of this kind, conducted outside Newgate and other prisons across the country, would continue for several more years before legislative changes brought the practice to an end, removing such proceedings from public view and confining them within the walls of the prison itself. The crowd that gathered on the morning of James Mullins' execution would have included, as was typical of such occasions during this period, a mixture of residents drawn by the particular notoriety the case had acquired through its extensive coverage in the press over the preceding months, together with those who attended such proceedings as a matter of regular practice whenever an execution was scheduled to take place at that location. Sellers of the printed broadsides that recounted the case moved through the crowd gathered outside Newgate on the morning of the execution, offering for a small sum the printed accounts of the crime, the trial, and the sentence that had brought those assembled to the scene. This practice, the sale of broadsides describing a case at the very place and moment of the condemned individual's execution, was a long-established feature of public hangings during this period, providing those in attendance with a printed record of the proceedings to carry away with them once the execution had concluded. The broadside associated with this particular case, describing the apprehension and examination of the man convicted of Mary Emsley's death, would have circulated among the crowd in this manner, one further channel through which the details of the case reached a wide public audience beyond those who followed its progress solely through the columns of the established newspapers. The prison authorities at Newgate, in accordance with the standard procedure governing executions of this period, would have completed the necessary formalities following the execution, including the certification of death and the entry of the proceedings into the official prison record before the body was removed for burial within the precincts of the jail, as was customary for those executed there during this period, rather than being returned to family for private interment. No account in the sources reviewed for this compilation describes any request by relatives of James Mullins for the return of his remains, nor any alternative disposition of his body following the completion of the execution. The broadside sold at the scene of the execution and preserved today among collections of English crime and execution ephemera followed the established conventions of such publications during this period, printed cheaply on a single folded sheet, combining a printed account of the crime and the trial with a woodcut illustration, commonly depicting either the scene of the crime, the exterior of the jail, or the moment of execution itself. Such broadsides frequently included, alongside the factual account of the case, a printed statement purporting to represent the final words or confession of the condemned individual, a genre convention of the period regardless of whether the condemned had in fact offered any such statement. And it is against this broader convention that the recorded final statement attributed to James Mullins, protesting his innocence rather than confessing to the crime, stands as a departure from the more typical form such broadside statements customarily took. The broadside associated with this case, titled The Stepney Murder, survives today among the holdings of a research institution's collection of English crime and execution broadsides, preserved as one example among many such publications produced throughout the middle decades of the 19th century to accompany notable criminal proceedings. These printed sheets were produced quickly in the days immediately surrounding a trial or execution, and sold in the streets by vendors who moved among crowds gathered for the occasion, a trade that operated alongside the more established newspaper press as a parallel channel for the circulation of accounts of criminal cases among a public whose appetite for such material remained considerable throughout this period. The survival of this particular broadside into modern archival collections has allowed later researchers examining the case to consult not only the formal record of the trial itself, but also the manner in which the case was presented to the ordinary public. At the time it unfolded, a presentation that emphasised the drama of the investigation, the discovery of the parcel, and the execution that concluded the proceedings, in a form intended for wide and immediate circulation rather than for the more measured record maintained by the court itself. The trial record itself, preserved among the proceedings of the Old Bailey, survives in a form quite different from the broadside sold upon the street, consisting of the formal transcription of the evidence and testimony presented before the court, catalogued and indexed for reference by later researchers under the case identifier assigned to the proceedings against James Mullins. In more recent decades, this record has been made available through a digitised archive of Old Bailey proceedings spanning several centuries, allowing researchers examining the case to consult the trial testimony directly rather than relying solely upon the second-hand accounts offered by contemporary newspapers or by the broadside sold at the time. This digitised record preserves the sequence of evidence as it was presented before the jury in October of 1860, offering a fuller and more exact account of the proceedings than either the press coverage or the broadside material could provide on its own. It is this combination of surviving sources, the formal trial record accessible through the modern archive, the extensive newspaper coverage published across the closing months of 1860, and the broadside sold in the street at the time of the execution, upon which Sinclair Mackay's later study of the case draws in reconstructing the investigation and the trial in detail. Mackay's account examines not only the evidence presented against James Mullins, but also the physical and social setting of Stepney and Bethnal Green in which Mary Emsley conducted her business, drawing upon the same combination of documentary sources to situate the case within the particular circumstances of the district as it stood in 1860. The book takes its subtitle directly from Arthur Conan Doyle's earlier essay, framing the case explicitly as one that a celebrated writer on unresolved criminal matters had himself declined to regard as conclusively settled by the verdict returned at trial. The continued attention paid to the case by writers, examining it across more than a century since the trial and execution took place, reflects in large part the particular combination of circumstances that distinguished it from many other capital convictions of the period, a conviction resting substantially on circumstantial evidence concerning the discovery and placement of a single parcel, an absence of physical evidence directly connecting the convicted man to the act of violence itself, and a condemned man who to the last offered no confession and maintained a consistent account of his own limited involvement in the matter. These circumstances, examined together, have ensured that the case has continued to be revisited long after the formal proceedings against James Mullins reached their conclusion in November of 1860. The position of Walter M. within the surviving accounts of the case merits particular note, given that he had been, for a brief period following the discovery of the parcel upon his premises, the object of initial police suspicion before the investigation's attention shifted decisively toward James Mullins. The sources reviewed in connection with this case are consistent in treating M as a man who had, through no fault of his own, been drawn into the investigation solely as a consequence of the parcel having been placed upon his property, and who was cleared of any suspicion once the precision of Mullins' directions to its location came under closer scrutiny by the investigating officers. Nothing in the surviving record indicates that M faced any formal charge in connection with Mary Emsley's death, nor that his position as a collector of rents and debts on her behalf was found, upon examination, to bear any connection to the circumstances of her killing beyond the use to which Mullins had put his premises in an apparent effort to divert suspicion elsewhere. The distinction between the two men, one of whom had, at an earlier point in his life, served in a police capacity before turning to other occupations, and both of whom had some measure of professional connection to Mary Emsley's affairs, was one that later writers examining the case took care to preserve, given the potential for the similarity of their backgrounds, to create confusion between a man who was tried and executed and a man who was never charged with any offence. Sinclair Mackay's account, together with the earlier essay by Arthur Conan Doyle, addressed the two men separately, and in terms that left no ambiguity as to which had been convicted of the crime and which had been cleared of any involvement in it, a clarity that the surviving trial record itself, centred as it was upon the case against Mullins specifically, likewise preserves. The house on M's premises in which the parcel had been discovered, like the house at Grove Road in which Mary Emsley had lived and died, formed part of the same dense pattern of East End residential building that characterised Stepney and Bethnal Green throughout this period. Streets in which tradesmen, rent collectors, and property owners of varying means lived and worked in close proximity to one another, their affairs frequently intersecting through the ordinary business of renting, repairing, and maintaining the housing stock that had grown up across the district over the preceding decades. It was within this closely woven pattern of local acquaintance and mutual dealing, rather than within any wider or more anonymous setting, that the events of August 1860 had unfolded, a fact that shaped both the course of the investigation, conducted among people who knew one another through years of local business, and the manner in which suspicion moved, in the space of a few weeks, from one man to another, before settling finally upon James Mullins. The case was entered into the historical record. It has remained there. The verdict stood. The case became part of British memory. That is where the record of the first case closes. The account now turns to a second file from the same century, drawn from a different corner of London and a different kind of neighbourhood, where a life spent apart from respectable society ended in a manner the authorities of the day were never able to fully explain. The circumstances differ from those already examined, yet the same unanswered question sits at the centre of the record. The case of Eliza Grimwood begins in Lambeth, on the south bank of the River Thames, in the spring of 1838. London in 1838 was the largest city in the world, home to close to 2 million residents, expanding rapidly beyond its historic core into new districts of brick terraces, lodging houses, and commercial premises that had scarcely existed a generation earlier. The city had been transformed within living memory by the construction of new bridges across the Thames, among them Waterloo Bridge, opened some 2 decades earlier, which had drawn traffic and settlement toward the South Bank in a manner that reshaped the character of the surrounding streets. Lambeth, in this period, was a district still in the process of establishing itself, positioned between the older riverside trades and the newer entertainments that had grown up around the theatres of the Strand and Covent Garden, reachable on foot across the bridge within a matter of minutes. Waterloo Road itself ran south from the bridge through a corridor of lodging houses, public houses, and small commercial establishments, many of them let out in furnished rooms to tenants whose circumstances varied considerably. The street was well known in this period as a route by which theatre patrons crossed from the West End to the south side of the river, and it had, by the late 1830s, acquired an association with a particular kind of nightlife that accompanied such traffic. The pavements were lit by gas lamps, a relatively recent innovation that had spread through central London over the preceding decade, casting a steady light along the principal thoroughfares while the side streets and courts remained comparatively dark. The Thames itself, a short distance to the north, carried barge and wherry traffic through the night, and the sound of the river was a constant presence for those who lived within its vicinity. The wider social character of the district in 1838 was shaped by its position between respectable commerce and a more transient population drawn by the proximity of the theatres and the bridge crossing. Lodging houses along Waterloo Road and its side streets let rooms on a weekly basis to a mixed population of clerks, tradespeople, and others whose means of support were less easily categorised. Policing in the district, as across London generally, was carried out at this date by the Metropolitan Police, an institution then less than a decade old, working alongside older systems of parish constables and magistrates that had not yet been fully superseded. The formal machinery of criminal investigation, familiar to later generations, including a dedicated detective branch within the Metropolitan Force, did not yet exist in 1838, and inquiries of the kind that would follow the events at Wellington Terrace were conducted by a combination of local officers, magistrates, and coroners, operating without many of the procedures that later criminal investigations would take for granted. It was within this setting that Eliza Grimwood made her home at Wellington Terrace, a row of houses on Waterloo Road, in the spring of 1838. The surviving record does not establish her exact age, her precise birthplace, or the details of her upbringing with certainty. Some later accounts have suggested a connection to Ipswich or the nearby Suffolk village of Stonham Aspel, but this connection has not been independently confirmed and is treated here as an unresolved lead rather than a settled fact. What the record does establish is that by 1838 Grimwood was living at Wellington Terrace in the company of a man named William Hubbard, with whom she had shared a household for a period of close to 10 years. Hubbard was, according to the surviving accounts, a married man who had separated from his wife, and some sources describe a family connection between Hubbard and Grimwood, though this detail has not been corroborated with sufficient certainty to be stated as established fact. The record further establishes that Grimwood supported herself during this period through prostitution, working within the area around Waterloo Road and the theatre district across the river. This was not an unusual arrangement for the district in which she lived. The neighbourhood surrounding the Strand and Covent Garden and the streets leading from the bridges that crossed into Lambeth and Southwark were widely associated in this period with such trade, a consequence of the concentration of theatres, taverns and lodging houses that drew large numbers of visitors into the area each evening. Grimwood's manner of earning a living, according to the surviving accounts, involved meeting men in the vicinity of the theatres and returning with them to her lodgings at Wellington Terrace, an arrangement that appears to have been an established pattern of her life by the time of the events under examination. The household at Wellington Terrace, so far as the record establishes, consisted of Grimwood and Hubbard, with Hubbard's occupation given in some accounts as that of a bricklayer, though this detail remains unconfirmed. The precise nature of their domestic arrangement, including how each regarded the other's role within the household, is not something the surviving record permits to be stated with confidence. What is established is that the two had lived together for a considerable period, and that Grimwood's evenings, in the ordinary course of her life, took her away from Wellington Terrace and across the river into the theatre district, from which she would return, often in the company of a client, in the late hours of the night. If you find value in histories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Now back to the record. The circumstances that led to the events of 26 May 1838 began, according to the surviving accounts, on the preceding evening when Grimwood was seen in the Strand by a companion named Catherine Edwin. Edwin later gave an account of having observed Grimwood that night in the company of a man whom she described as having the appearance of a foreigner, dressed in the manner of a gentleman and speaking fluent English. According to Edwin's account, this man had been known to Grimwood for some months prior to that evening, suggesting that he was not a stranger encountered for the first time, but rather an acquaintance with whom she had some prior familiarity. The surviving record does not resolve with certainty the exact chronology connecting this sighting in the Strand to the events that followed at Wellington Terrace in the early hours of the following morning, and the account here proceeds on the understanding that Grimwood was seen with this man on the evening preceding her death, and returned to her lodgings in his company. The man in question was never identified by name. Contemporary accounts described him variously as Italian, a description that appears in the sources closest to the events themselves, though later retellings of the case sometimes refer to a French gentleman in his place. The surviving record does not permit this discrepancy to be resolved with confidence, and the account here follows the more specific contemporary description of an Italian gentleman, a fluent speaker of English, while noting that the identification of his nationality was not conclusively established at the time, and has not been settled since. What is consistent across the accounts is the general description of a well-dressed man, evidently possessed of some means, whose manner and speech marked him as different from the ordinary clientele of the district, and who had reportedly been acquainted with Grimwood for a period of months before the night in question. Grimwood returned to Wellington Terrace in the early hours of 26th of May 1838, according to the surviving accounts, in the company of this man. William Hubbard, her long-time household companion, was in the vicinity of Wellington Terrace that night, and his own presence in the household during the hours immediately surrounding Grimwood's death would later become a central point of inquiry. The precise sequence of events within the house that night, including who else may have been present or absent from Wellington Terrace, is not established by the surviving record with the level of detail that would allow a confident account of the household's movements to be given. What is established is that Eliza Grimwood was found dead at Wellington Terrace on the morning of 26th May 1838. The surviving record does not identify with certainty the individual who first discovered her body. And no name is given in the sources reviewed for this account. The cause of death was later established as a wound to the throat, a cut extending from near one ear to the other, of sufficient severity to sever the windpipe. The injuries she sustained were severe and rapidly fatal. A physician was called to examine the body, and the examination that followed formed the basis for the medical evidence later presented to the coroner. A wound to Grimwood's left thumb was also noted by those who examined her, and this injury was interpreted at the time as an indication that she had struggled with her attacker in the moments before her death. The discovery of Grimwood's body at Wellington Terrace on the morning of 26th May 1838 set in motion an investigation that would occupy the attention of the local authorities, the coroner, and the London press for a considerable period afterward, without ever arriving at a conclusion that satisfied the questions the case had raised. The household at Wellington Terrace was disturbed, the neighbourhood was alerted, and word of the killing spread quickly through a district already accustomed to the traffic of the theatre trade and the nightly comings and goings of Waterloo Road. The investigation that followed, conducted within the limits of the policing methods available in 1838, would in time come to focus on two principal lines of inquiry, neither of which would produce a conviction. The investigation that followed the discovery at Wellington Terrace was conducted by the local police and magistrates serving the Lambeth district, working in conjunction with the officers of the newly established Metropolitan Police Force. In the days immediately following 26 May 1838, officers were dispatched to gather statements from those who had known Grimwood and from those who had been in the vicinity of Wellington Terrace and the surrounding streets on the night of her death. The investigation proceeded without the benefit of a dedicated detective branch, a body that would not be formally established within the Metropolitan Force for some years afterward, and inquiries of this kind in 1838 depended heavily on the diligence of individual officers, the cooperation of witnesses, and the willingness of the public to come forward with information. Catherine Edwin's account of having seen Grimwood in the Strand on the evening before her death in the company of a well-dressed foreign gentleman became one of the central pieces of testimony gathered in the early stages of the inquiry. Edwin's description of the man, his manner of dress, his fluent command of English, and her understanding that he had been acquainted with Grimwood for some months, formed the basis for the first and most persistent line of suspicion pursued by the investigators. Officers made inquiries in the theatre district, and among those who frequented the Strand and Covent Garden in an effort to identify the man Edwin had described, circulating what description could be assembled from her account among those with knowledge of the area. No name was ever attached to the description with sufficient confidence to bring a charge, and the man was never identified by the investigation. William Hubbard, Grimwood's longtime household companion, became the second focus of the inquiry as the investigation proceeded through the early weeks of June 1838. Hubbard's presence in the vicinity of Wellington Terrace on the night of the killing, together with his close and lengthy association with Grimwood, made him a natural subject of scrutiny for the investigating officers. The inquiry into Hubbard's movements and conduct was given further impetus by the receipt of an anonymous letter, delivered to the authorities in the course of the investigation, purporting to have been written by the very man who had accompanied Grimwood home on the night in question. The letter's contents and the circumstances of its delivery were examined by the investigating officers as a possible avenue toward identifying either the foreign gentleman described by Edwin or clarifying Hubbard's own role in the matter. On 11 June 1838, William Hubbard was committed to Horsemonger Lane Gaol, a facility that served the county of Surrey and the districts on the south side of the river, pending further examination of the evidence gathered against him. His committal followed directly from the anonymous letter and from the broader pattern of suspicion that had accumulated around his presence at Wellington Terrace on the night of Grimwood's death. Hubbard was held at Horsemonger Lane, while the magistrates considered whether the evidence available was sufficient to proceed further against him. The investigating officers, in the course of this period, continued to weigh the relative strength of the case against Hubbard alongside the unresolved description of the foreign gentleman supplied by Catherine Edwin. Inspector Field, an officer of the Metropolitan Police associated with the investigation, was reported to have concluded that the true suspect in the case was to be found among these two men, either the unidentified foreign gentleman or William Hubbard himself. This conclusion, however, did not translate into evidence sufficient to sustain a charge against either. The examination before the magistrates proceeded on the basis of the material gathered by the investigating officers, and Hubbard's own testimony and that of others acquainted with the household at Wellington Terrace were weighed against the anonymous letter and the surrounding circumstances of his presence in the vicinity on the night in question. The examination of William Hubbard before the magistrates concluded without sufficient evidence being found to sustain a charge against him. Hubbard was discharged from custody, and the record of the case does not establish any further formal action taken against him by the authorities. Following his discharge, Hubbard is reported in the surviving accounts to have emigrated to America, removing himself from the district in which the investigation had centred and from the ongoing public attention that the case continued to attract in the London press. No further legal proceedings were brought against him, and the surviving record does not establish the subsequent course of his life beyond the fact of his emigration. The investigation, having examined and ultimately released the two principal figures of suspicion, was unable to identify any other individual against whom sufficient evidence could be assembled. Officers continued to make inquiries in the weeks following Hubbard's discharge, circulating what descriptions remained available and following such leads as presented themselves, but no arrest followed. The investigating authorities were left, by the middle of the summer of 1838, with an unresolved case, a body of testimony that pointed toward two possible figures without confirming either, and a description of an unidentified man that had not led to his apprehension. The London press of the period gave the case extensive and sustained coverage, a fact that reflected both the violence of the killing and the particular circumstances surrounding it. The combination of a victim whose manner of life placed her outside conventional, respectable society, a suspect described as a well-dressed gentleman of apparent foreign origin, and an investigation that appeared unable to reach a conclusion, was sufficient to sustain public interest in the case for a considerable period following the events of May and June 1838. Newspaper accounts of the period recorded the progress of the investigation, the committal and subsequent discharge of William Hubbard, and such details of the case as the authorities were prepared to make public, contributing to a level of attention that extended well beyond the immediate vicinity of Waterloo Road. Speculation surrounding the identity of Grimwood's killer was not confined to the two figures examined by the official investigation. Rumour within the period extended, in its more extravagant forms, to the suggestion that a member of the royal family might have been responsible, a claim that belongs to the realm of contemporary gossip rather than to any evidence considered by the investigating authorities. Such speculation illustrates the degree to which the case had captured public imagination during 1838, though it did not form any part of the formal investigation and was never substantiated by the officers or magistrates who examined the available evidence. A coroner's inquest was convened in the days following the discovery of Grimwood's body, in accordance with the established procedure for a sudden and violent death within the jurisdiction. The specific name of the coroner who presided over the proceedings and the exact venue and dates on which the inquest was held are not established with certainty in the surviving record, and the account here does not attempt to supply detail beyond what the record confirms. The inquest jury heard testimony from those who had knowledge of the circumstances surrounding Grimwood's death, including evidence relating to the discovery of her body, the medical findings, and such information as had been gathered by the investigating officers regarding her movements on the night in question. The physician who had examined Grimwood's body presented evidence to the inquest jury concerning the cause of death, confirming that she had died as a result of a wound to the throat, and that the wound to her thumb was consistent with a struggle having taken place before her death. This medical testimony formed a central part of the evidence placed before the jury, establishing beyond doubt that Grimwood had been killed by violence and had not died by accident or by her own hand. The jury's task, on the basis of this and the other testimony presented, was to determine the manner of Grimwood's death and, so far as the evidence allowed, to identify responsibility for it. The inquest jury returned a verdict of willful murder against a person or persons unknown. This verdict reflected the state of the evidence available to the authorities at the conclusion of the formal proceedings, confirming that Grimwood had been unlawfully killed while leaving the identity of her killer unresolved. The verdict of the coroner's jury stood as the final formal determination reached by any tribunal in the case. No individual was ever charged with sufficient evidence to proceed to trial, and the examination of William Hubbard before the magistrates, followed by his discharge, represented the closest the case came to a formal judicial proceeding beyond the inquest itself. The case of Eliza Grimwood therefore never reached the assizes, and no jury was ever asked to weigh the guilt of any accused person in a criminal trial arising from her death. The absence of any trial left the case in an unusual position within the public memory of 1838. The investigation had produced two figures of suspicion, extensive newspaper coverage, and a coroner's verdict acknowledging that murder had been committed, yet it had produced no defendant, no courtroom proceeding, and no resolution beyond the formal acknowledgement that the crime had occurred and that its author remained unidentified. This combination of extensive public attention and a wholly unresolved outcome distinguished the case from many others examined in the criminal records of the period and contributed to its lasting, if narrow, place within accounts of unsolved London killings. The murder of Eliza Grimwood has since been credited by literary historians with a direct influence on the work of Charles Dickens, whose novel Oliver Twist was being published in serial form during the very months in which the case unfolded. Scholars examining the composition of Oliver Twist have identified points of correspondence between the killing of Grimwood at Wellington Terrace and Dickens' later depiction of the murder of the character Nancy within the novel, a connection that has become the case's most durable legacy within British cultural history. Dickens was known to have taken an active interest in the criminal cases of his day, and the timing of the Grimwood killing, occurring as he was composing the later sections of the novel, has been treated by scholars as more than coincidental. This literary connection has kept the case from disappearing entirely from historical memory, even as the broader details of the investigation faded from public awareness over the following decades. The case has been the subject of a modern full-length study by the historian Jan Bonderson, whose account of the investigation drew together the surviving contemporary sources into a single narrative treatment of the killing and the inquiry that followed it, published under a title that drew its own comparison between the unresolved nature of the Grimwood case and the later, more widely known, unsolved killings associated with Whitechapel in 1888. This connection between the Grimwood case and the composition of Oliver Twist has meant that the killing has been examined chiefly within the specialised circles of Dickens scholarship and true crime history, rather than occupying a place within the broader public memory of Victorian crime that later cases would come to hold. The case did not produce the kind of enduring courtroom drama, the named and convicted defendant, or the executed prisoner that tended to fix a killing within popular memory across succeeding generations. What survived instead was the documentary record itself. The newspaper columns of 1838, the inquest verdict, the committal and discharge of William Hubbard, and the literary echo that scholars have traced within a novel being written at the very time the case was unfolding. The district in which the killing occurred continued to develop across the middle decades of the 19th century, and Waterloo Road retained its character as a route connecting the theatres of the West End with the residential and commercial streets of Lambeth. The lodging houses and furnished rooms that had characterised the street in 1838 persisted for decades afterward, continuing to accommodate a shifting population of tenants whose circumstances varied as widely as they had in the year of Grimwood's death. The particular house at Wellington Terrace in which he had lived with William Hubbard did not acquire the kind of lasting notoriety that would attach itself to certain other addresses associated with unsolved London killings of the 19th century, and the terrace itself passed through subsequent decades without becoming a site of pilgrimage or public memorial. The case occupies a position within the broader record of unsolved homicides investigated by London's early police authorities during the first years of the Metropolitan Force's existence. The Metropolitan Police, established in 1829, was still in the process, in 1838, of developing the institutional experience and procedural methods that would in later decades allow for more systematic approaches to the investigation of violent crime. The Grimwood case, conducted without a dedicated detective branch and without many of the forensic and procedural tools that would become available to investigators later in the century, illustrates the practical limitations under which such inquiries were conducted in the years immediately following the force's founding. The reliance on witness testimony, such as that provided by Catherine Edwin, and on circumstantial suspicion, such as that directed toward William Hubbard, characterised the investigative methods available to the authorities of the period, methods that, in this instance, proved insufficient to identify Grimwood's killer with the certainty required to bring a charge. The absence of a named and convicted killer left the case permanently open within the historical record, a state that distinguishes it from the great majority of homicide cases from the period that eventually produced a trial, a verdict, and in many instances, a sentence of execution. The record of Eliza Grimwood's death, as it survives, consists of the inquest testimony, the newspaper accounts of 1838, the details of William Hubbard's committal and discharge, and the later scholarly treatment of the case by historians examining its connection to Dickens's fiction. No further official investigation into the killing appears to have been undertaken in the years following the conclusion of the original enquiry, and no new evidence emerged in the decades that followed to alter the verdict returned by the coroner's jury in 1838. The character of Waterloo Road and the surrounding streets of Lambeth in the years following Grimwood's death continued to reflect the particular social conditions that had shaped her own life and the circumstances of her death. The proximity of the theatre district across the river, the concentration of lodging houses catering to a transient population, and the absence in this period of the kind of systematic social investigation that later decades would bring to bear on London's poorer districts, meant that the conditions Grimwood had lived within persisted largely unexamined by the authorities of her own time. The case stood within the record of London crime during the early Victorian period as an example of a killing that received extensive contemporary attention without ever achieving legal resolution, its final status recorded plainly in the verdict of the coroner's jury and nowhere altered since. The newspapers that carried the case through the summer of 1838 included several of the principal London dailies and weeklies of the period, publications that devoted regular columns to police and coroner's proceedings as a matter of established practice. Reports of the Grimwood case appeared under headings devoted to police intelligence and metropolitan crime, set alongside accounts of magistrates' hearings, coroners' inquests, and other matters of daily criminal business drawn from across the capital. The style of such reporting in 1838 was dense and largely unadorned, presenting testimony in summary form, recording the substance of witness statements, and noting the observations of magistrates and coroners with a degree of procedural detail that later generations of crime reporting would abandon in favour of more condensed and dramatic treatment. The examination of William Hubbard before the magistrates took place at a police office of the kind that served the Lambeth district in this period, a setting considerably more modest than the courtrooms later associated with major criminal trials. Such proceedings were conducted before a sitting magistrate without a jury and were open to members of the public and the press, who crowded into the small chambers set aside for such business whenever a case of particular interest was heard. The examination of Hubbard drew considerable public attention given the notoriety the case had already acquired in the days following the discovery of Grimwood's body, and newspaper correspondents were present to record the proceedings in the detail that would later form the basis of the published accounts. Horsemonger Lane Gaol, where Hubbard was held during the period of his committal, served as the principal prison for the county of Surrey, standing a short distance from Waterloo Road on the south side of the river. The gaol held both those awaiting trial and those already convicted, and conditions within such institutions in 1838 were governed by regulations that had only recently begun to move away from the older, less structured practices of the 18th century. Hubbard's confinement there, pending the outcome of the magistrates' examination, would have placed him among a population of prisoners held on a wide range of charges, from minor offences to capital crimes, in a facility that also served, in this period, as a site of public execution for the county. The period during which Hubbard remained in custody at Horsemonger Lane was one in which the investigating officers continued to gather what further testimony could be obtained from those acquainted with the household at Wellington Terrace and with Grimwood's own circle of associates in the theatre district. The anonymous letter that had prompted his committal remained a subject of scrutiny throughout this period, examined for any detail of handwriting, content, or knowledge of the case that might indicate its author's identity or connection to the events at Wellington Terrace. No such determination was ever reached with sufficient confidence to alter the course of the inquiry, and the letter itself passed into the record of the case as one more piece of evidence that pointed toward possibility without arriving at certainty. Word of the killing spread through the streets surrounding Wellington Terrace within hours of the discovery of Grimwood's body, and residents of the neighbouring houses gathered outside the terrace throughout the morning of 26th May, drawn by the presence of officers and the evident gravity of what had occurred within. Such gatherings were an ordinary feature of London street life in response to a violent death, and the crowd that assembled at Wellington Terrace that morning reflected the close and interconnected character of the lodging house district, in which the residents of neighbouring properties were often well acquainted with one another's comings and goings. Some among the crowd would later be approached by the investigating officers for whatever information they might supply regarding Grimwood's habits, her visitors, and the movements of the household in the days preceding her death. The theatre district from which Grimwood had returned on the night of her death encompassed the playhouses clustered around the Strand and Covent Garden, among them the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane, and the Theatre Royal, Covent Garden, both long established as principal venues of London's dramatic entertainment and both drawing substantial evening crowds throughout the 1830s. Performances in this period typically concluded in the later hours of the evening, releasing large numbers of patrons onto the surrounding streets at an hour when the theatres, bars, supper rooms, and the taverns nearby continued to do a brisk trade. It was from among this dispersing crowd in the streets and taverns surrounding the playhouses that Grimwood conducted the business by which she supported herself, meeting clients among the theatre patrons before making the crossing back over Waterloo Bridge to her lodgings at Wellington Terrace. Catherine Edwin, whose testimony placed Grimwood in the company of the unidentified foreign gentleman on the night preceding her death, was herself a figure of the same district and the same manner of life, a circumstance that lent her account a familiarity with the habits and associations of the theatre district's nightly trade. Her recognition of the man as someone previously acquainted with Grimwood, rather than a stranger encountered for the first time, was treated by the investigating officers as a detail of particular significance, suggesting an existing relationship between Grimwood and her final companion that distinguished this encounter from the more casual arrangements that characterised much of her trade. Edwin's willingness to come forward and provide this account to the authorities formed one of the few pieces of direct testimony available to the investigation regarding the hours immediately preceding Grimwood's death, and her description of the man remained, throughout the course of the inquiry, the only detailed physical account of the individual most strongly suspected of the killing. Waterloo Bridge, across which Grimwood and her final companion would have passed on their way from the Strand to Wellington Terrace, was in 1838 a toll bridge, opened some 2 decades earlier and maintained by a private company that charged a fee to those crossing on foot or by vehicle. The bridge stood as one of several such crossings linking the City and West End to the districts of the South Bank, its broad carriageway and stone balustrades offering an approach to Lambeth distinct from the older and more congested crossing at Westminster. Pedestrians making the crossing late at night paid a halfpenny toll at the toll houses positioned at either end of the bridge, a small transaction that formed part of the ordinary rhythm of the nightly traffic between the theatre district and the streets of Lambeth. The keepers of these toll houses, present through the night to collect the fee from those passing, were among the individuals whose testimony investigators might, in principle, have sought regarding the movements of pedestrians crossing in the small hours. Though the surviving record does not indicate that any such testimony was obtained in connection with Grimwood's final crossing, the district surrounding Waterloo Road had, in the years before and after 1838, produced other cases of violence connected to the trade Grimwood pursued, though none achieved the same degree of contemporary notoriety as her own death. The concentration of lodging houses, the transient nature of much of the population, and the nightly movement of theatre patrons through streets that were only partially and unevenly lit beyond the main thoroughfares, created conditions in which crimes against women engaged in prostitution were neither uncommon nor, in the ordinary course of events, likely to receive the sustained investigative attention that Grimwood's case attracted. What distinguished her death from these lesser-remembered cases was the combination of the victim's decade-long domestic arrangement with Hubbard, the description of a gentleman companion offered by Catherine Edwin, and the anonymous letter that had precipitated Hubbard's own committal, elements that together sustained a level of press and official interest unusual for a case of its kind. The Metropolitan Police Division, responsible for the Lambeth district in 1838, designated L Division, maintained a body of constables who patrolled fixed beats through the streets surrounding Waterloo Road on a rotating nightly schedule, each officer typically responsible for a stretch of several streets that he walked at a measured pace through the hours of darkness. A constable on such a beat might pass along Waterloo Road and its side streets several times in the course of a single night, checking doors, observing those abroad at a late hour, and remaining alert for any disturbance requiring his intervention. The presence of such patrols meant that an officer had, in principle, some chance of observing Grimwood and her companion as they made their way from the bridge to Wellington Terrace on the night in question, though the surviving record does not indicate that any constable on duty that night came forward with testimony describing having seen the pair. The limitations of foot patrol coverage across a district as extensive as Lambeth, divided among a comparatively small number of constables for each division, meant that long stretches of the street, particularly in the smaller courts and side turnings off the main thoroughfare, remained largely unobserved through the greater part of the night. The pay and conditions of the constables who served on such beats in 1838 were themselves modest, a circumstance that contributed to a body of officers whose experience and training varied considerably from one man to the next, and whose capacity to gather and assess evidence in a case as complex as Grimwood's killing was correspondingly uneven. The investigation into her death drew upon whatever officers were available within L Division and such assistance as could be summoned from the wider metropolitan force, but the absence of any specialised investigative unit meant that the burden of gathering testimony, tracing the movements of suspects, and assembling a case for the magistrates fell to constables whose ordinary duties lay in patrol rather than inquiry. This circumstance, common to homicide investigations across London in this period, contributed materially to the case remaining unresolved, as no single officer or body of officers held responsibility for the sustained and systematic pursuit of the case in the manner that later criminal investigations would come to expect. The houses that made up Wellington Terrace were typical of the modest brick terraces that had risen along Waterloo Road and its immediate side streets in the years following the bridge's construction. Narrow-fronted dwellings of 2 or 3 stories, let out in furnished rooms to a succession of tenants rather than occupied as single-family residences. Such houses commonly divided their accommodation by floor, with a landlord or principal tenant occupying part of the property and subletting the remaining rooms, an arrangement well suited to a district in which many residents required lodging for weeks or months rather than years. The rooms occupied by Grimwood and Hubbard within Wellington Terrace would have been furnished simply, in keeping with the modest rents such lodgings commanded, and the household's day-to-day existence would have unfolded within the confines of a small number of rooms shared between the two of them across the near decade of their residence there. The proximity of Wellington Terrace to the river and to Waterloo Road itself meant that the household lived within constant hearing of the traffic that passed along the thoroughfare through the greater part of the night. The sound of carriages, foot traffic returning from the theatres, and the occasional disturbance that accompanied the district's nightlife, forming an unremarkable backdrop to the ordinary course of domestic life within the terrace. Neighbouring households, similarly let out in furnished rooms, would have included tenants engaged in a variety of occupations, and the degree of acquaintance between one household and the next. Along the terrace was, in the manner typical of such lodging districts, sufficient for neighbours to recognise the comings and goings of the households nearby, without necessarily possessing detailed knowledge of the particular arrangements within any one of them. Coroners' inquests in this period were commonly convened not in a purpose-built courtroom, but in a nearby public house, or similar establishment large enough to accommodate the jury, the witnesses, and members of the public who wished to attend, a practice that reflected the absence of dedicated coronial premises in most London districts at this date. The jury summoned for such an inquest was drawn from among the local householders and tradesmen of the parish in which the death had occurred, a body of 12 or more men who were sworn to examine the evidence and return a verdict as to the cause and circumstances of death. Such jurors served without specialised legal training, relying upon the direction of the coroner presiding over the proceedings and upon the testimony of witnesses and medical men called before them to reach their determination. The jury summoned to examine the circumstances of Grimwood's death would, in the ordinary course of such proceedings, have viewed her body prior to the taking of testimony, a practice required of coroners' juries in this period as a means of confirming for themselves the fact and apparent manner of death before hearing the evidence of witnesses. This requirement, standard to coronial procedure throughout the first half of the 19th century, placed upon the jurors a direct and immediate acquaintance with the physical reality of the case they had been called to consider, an acquaintance that later reforms to coronial law would in time modify. Having viewed the body and heard the testimony of the physician, of Catherine Edwin, and of such other witnesses as the coroner saw fit to call, the jury proceeded to its deliberation and arrived at the verdict of wilful murder against a person or persons unknown that stands as the case's final formal determination. Following the conclusion of the inquest and the return of its verdict, arrangements were made for Grimwood's burial in accordance with the customary practice observed for parishioners of Lambeth in this period. The formalities attending her interment closing the immediate procedural business of the case, even as the question of her killer's identity remained entirely unresolved. The parish records of the period, in the ordinary course of such matters, would have noted the burial without further comment upon the circumstances of death. The register entry, standing as a plain administrative record, separate from the more extensive documentation generated by the inquest and the newspaper accounts. In the decades that followed, the case found a place within a body of published writing devoted to the unsolved criminal mysteries of Victorian London. Works compiled by later chroniclers who drew upon the surviving newspaper accounts and court records to preserve cases that might otherwise have faded entirely from public knowledge. Among these later treatments, the writer Charles Pearce included an account of the Grimwood case within a compilation devoted to unsolved murders, drawing upon the period language of the original reports to reconstruct the sequence of events at Wellington Terrace, the committal and discharge of William Hubbard, and the wider rumour that had attended the case in its own time. Such compilations served across the closing decades of the 19th century and into the 20th as the principal means by which cases lacking a resolved verdict or an executed prisoner were preserved within the broader record of English criminal history. Their inclusion dependent less upon the eventual outcome of an investigation than upon the degree of contemporary attention a case had originally attracted. Pearce's compilation, and others of its kind produced across the final decades of the 19th century, typically took the form of substantial volumes divided into individual chapters, each devoted to a single case and constructed from the surviving newspaper reports, inquest testimony, and court records available to the compiler at the time of writing. Such works found a ready readership among a public whose appetite for accounts of true crime had been established over the preceding decades through the continuing publication of trial reports, execution broadsides, and the crime columns of the daily press, an appetite that had not diminished with the passage of time since the events themselves. The chapter devoted to Grimwood's case within such a compilation would have stood alongside accounts of other unresolved London killings, presented to readers as instances in which the machinery of justice, for want of sufficient evidence, had been unable to reach the conclusion that the public and the authorities alike had hoped for at the outset of the original investigation. The 20th century brought further, more specialised attention to the case from those researching the literary connections between actual criminal events and the fiction of the period, a line of enquiry that intensified as scholars examined more closely the circumstances under which Dickens composed the later chapters of Oliver Twist during the very weeks in which the Grimwood case unfolded in the press. This scholarly attention, distinct in character from the earlier true crime compilations, situated the case within the history of English literature rather than within the history of criminal investigation alone. And it is through this literary avenue, as much as through the original criminal record, that the case has continued to be examined by researchers in the years since. Bonderson's modern study drew together the scattered contemporary sources into a single continuous narrative for the first time in over a century. Assembling the newspaper reports of May and June 1838, the record of Hubbard's committal and discharge, and the surviving detail of Catherine Edwin's testimony into a work of sustained historical reconstruction, rather than the brief chapter treatment the case had previously received within the older compilations. This modern treatment allowed the case to be examined with a degree of narrative continuity that the fragmentary contemporary sources, scattered across successive issues of the period's newspapers, had not by themselves provided, and it placed the Grimwood case before a readership considerably larger than the specialised circles of Dickens scholarship that had sustained interest in it through much of the 20th century. The theatre district itself, in the years following 1838, continued its long association with the trade Grimwood had pursued. The pattern of playhouse crowds, dispersing nightly into the surrounding streets and taverns, persisting largely unchanged through the middle decades of the century. The bridges connecting this district to Lambeth and the streets south of the river carried the same nightly traffic of patrons, performers, and those who depended upon the theatre crowds for their livelihood, a pattern of London life that the killing of a single woman, however extensively reported at the time, did little to alter in any lasting or official way. The absence of reform measures traceable directly to the case, whether in policing, in the regulation of lodging houses, or in the conduct of coroners' inquests, distinguishes it from other Victorian killings whose aftermath produced identifiable changes to law or practice, leaving the Grimwood case to stand within the historical record chiefly as an unresolved event rather than as a catalyst for subsequent reform. The record available for this account does not establish where Eliza Grimwood was born, nor does it identify with certainty her parents, her age at the time of her death, or the years of her life before she came to reside at Wellington Terrace. A single title among the sources examined in preparing this account raises a possible connection to Ipswich or to the nearby Suffolk village of Stonham Aspel, but this lead has not been corroborated by parish registers or other primary documentation, and it is presented here only as a question that remains open rather than as an established fact of her origin. Whatever circumstances brought her from wherever she began her life, to the streets surrounding Waterloo Road, and into the household she shared for close to a decade with William Hubbard, are not preserved in any documents available to this account. This absence of biographical detail was not unusual for a woman of Grimwood's circumstances in 1838. Parish registers of birth and baptism from the period survive unevenly, and a woman who had left her place of birth to make her way in London, particularly one who supported herself outside the more conventional trades that generated employment records, letters, or other documentary traces, was liable to leave behind a far thinner paper record than a person of greater means or more settled occupation. What survives of Grimwood's life, in consequence, is confined almost entirely to the final weeks and days before her death, preserved through the accounts of those who knew her in that period, the testimony gathered by the investigating officers, and the record of the inquest that examined the circumstances of her killing. The decade she spent at Wellington Terrace with William Hubbard represents the only sustained period of her life for which any documentary record exists at all. The identity of the perpetrator was not established, no conviction followed, none was ever sought. That is where the record of the second case ends. There is one more case to examine, the last of the three, further from London than the others, and further still from anything resembling fame. It concerns a small congregation, a market town in Kent, and a question that a coroner's jury sat with for longer than most inquests of the period ever required, without ever settling it. The case of Harriet Monckton begins in Bromley, Kent, in 1843. Bromley at this date was a modest market town in West Kent, some 10 miles southeast of London. Its economy built around its weekly market, its coaching trade along the road to Tunbridge Wells and the coast, and a scattering of small trades and shopkeeping that served the surrounding agricultural parishes. The town's population at the time numbered only a few thousand persons, considerably smaller than the East End districts and riverside boroughs more commonly associated with the criminal history of this period. Its streets were narrow and largely unpaved beyond the principal thoroughfare, lined with brick and timber buildings that combined shop fronts with domestic dwellings above and behind them. Bromley in 1843 retained much of the character of a country town rather than a suburb, though its proximity to the capital meant that its citizens were not isolated from London's commerce, its newspapers, or its religious movements. Religious life in Bromley in this period was organised principally around the parish church of the established church, but the town also supported a number of nonconformist congregations, among them an independent or congregationalist chapel with an active membership drawn from the town's tradespeople, shopkeepers, and their families. Congregationalist chapels of this era operated with considerable independence from central ecclesiastical authority, governed largely by their own ministers and lay members, and functioned as close-knit communities in which religious observance, social life, and personal acquaintance were closely intertwined. Attendance at chapel meetings, prayer meetings, and associated social occasions brought members of the congregation into regular and sustained contact with one another in a manner that extended well beyond the hours of formal worship. It was within this particular congregation and within the social world that surrounded it that Harriet Monckton was known. Harriet Monckton was, at the time of her death, 23 years of age. The surviving record does not establish her exact date or place of birth, nor does it identify her parents by name or occupation. What the record does establish is that she was regarded within her community as being of respectable parentage and religious habits, and that she was an active and recognised member of the Bromley Independent Chapel. One source describes her as having worked as a schoolmistress, a role consistent with the standing she held within the congregation, though this detail rests on a single account rather than being corroborated across multiple sources. No record has been located of any marriage. Harriet Monckton is therefore treated in this account as an unmarried woman, a fact that bears directly on the circumstances that were to follow. The absence of a documented family history for Harriet Monckton is not unusual for a woman of her station in this period. Parish registers of the early 19th century did not always survive intact, and a woman who did not marry and who left no direct descendants to preserve family papers was less likely to leave behind the kind of documentary trail that a landowner, a tradesman of substantial property, or a public figure might generate. What can be said is that by 1843 she was established in Bromley, known to the congregation of the Independent Chapel, and sufficiently integrated into its social life, that her death, when it came, was felt within that community as the loss of one of its own. The Independent Chapel itself stood at the centre of the community in which Harriet Monckton's final months were spent. Congregationalist worship in this period placed considerable emphasis on personal conversion, on scriptural study, and on a close, almost familial bond among members of the congregation. Meetings were held not only on Sundays, but frequently during the week, for prayer, for instruction, and for the general business of the chapel. The minister of such a congregation held a position of considerable influence, both spiritual and social, and was typically in frequent contact with members of his flock, particularly those, such as Harriet Monckton, who appear to have taken an active role in the chapel's affairs. It was within this setting and among this circle of chapel members that the persons later named in connection with her death were to be found. Among those most closely associated with Harriet Monckton within the life of the chapel was the Reverend George Verrill, who served as minister of the Bromley Independent Congregation. As minister, Verrill would have had frequent occasion to meet with members of his congregation individually in matters of spiritual counsel, chapel administration, and pastoral visitation. The nature and extent of his personal acquaintance with Harriet Monckton beyond these ordinary pastoral duties is not established with certainty in the surviving record, though his name was to be raised repeatedly in the course of the inquiries that followed her death. Verrill continued to live for many years afterward, dying in 1880, and the record does not indicate that he was ever formally charged with any offence in connection with the case. Also within Harriet Monckton's circle of acquaintance was Thomas Blackstone Churcher, a young man born in Bromley in 1818, who worked as a shoemaker and who at times also undertook work as a debt collector. Churcher has been described in accounts of the case as a man of quiet and diffident temperament, one whose regard for Harriet Monckton was, according to the same accounts, deeply felt but never openly declared. Whatever the precise nature of the connection between them, Churcher's name, like Verrill's, was to be raised in the course of the investigation that followed her death without ever proceeding to formal charge. Two further individuals figure in the surviving accounts of Harriet Monckton's circle. Frances Williams, a fellow schoolmistress, was known to be a close friend of Harriet Monckton, and is described in some accounts as having held a particular attachment to her. Richard Field was known to have been, at an earlier point, Harriet Monckton's landlord and a suitor or lover. The precise nature and duration of Field's connection to her is not established in full detail by the surviving record. What can be said of all four of these individuals, Verrill, Churcher, Williams, and Field, is that each was drawn into the inquiries that followed Harriet Monckton's death, that each was named at various points as a person of interest, and that none of them was ever formally charged with any offence arising from the case. By the autumn of 1843, Harriet Monckton was approximately 6 months pregnant. The identity of the father of the child she carried is not established in the surviving record. This fact, more than any other, was to shape the direction of the inquiries that followed her death, since an unmarried woman's pregnancy in a small and closely observed religious community of this period carried with it considerable social consequence, and since the question of paternity was to remain throughout the long process that followed unanswered. The record does not permit any conclusion as to who fathered the child, and no such conclusion is offered here. It is sufficient to record that the pregnancy was established by medical examination after her death, and that it formed a central feature of the case from its earliest days. The exact circumstances of Harriet Monckton's final hours on the evening of 7th November 1843 are not recorded with precision in the sources that survive. What is established is that she was a regular attendee at the Independent Chapel, that she was known and observed within its community in the ordinary course of her life during this period, and that on the evening in question she came to be at or near the chapel premises. The surviving record does not permit a detailed reconstruction of her movements earlier that day, nor does it identify with certainty the last person to have seen her before her death. Where the record is silent on these points, no account is offered here beyond what can be stated with confidence. What is established beyond question is the outcome of that evening. Harriet Monckton was found dead in the privy situated behind the Independent Chapel in Bromley. The cause of her death was determined to be poisoning by prussic acid, a fast-acting and highly toxic substance, also known in later usage as cyanide, capable of causing death within minutes of ingestion. She was, at the time of her death, approximately 6 months pregnant, a fact confirmed by the medical examination that followed. The precise circumstances of her discovery, including the identity of the person who found her and the exact hour at which she was found, are not established with confidence in the sources reviewed for this account, and are not stated here as fact. The death of a young woman under such circumstances, within the grounds of a place of worship, and involving a member of a tightly bound religious congregation, was certain to provoke inquiry, both official and unofficial. The investigation that followed was to prove unusually protracted, extending across postponements and adjournments for a period that would eventually span some 3 years from the date of her death, a duration highly irregular even by the standards of coronial practice in this period. Before turning to that investigation, it is necessary to consider more fully the world in which Harriet Monckton lived during her final months, the chapel community that surrounded her, and the particular pressures that bore upon an unmarried woman in her circumstances within a small Kentish town in the early years of Queen Victoria's reign. Bromley in 1843 was a town in which private conduct was rarely, in practice, entirely private. A congregation of the size that gathered at the independent chapel, drawn substantially from tradespeople and their families resident within a compact area of the town, functioned as a network of mutual observation as much as one of mutual support. Attendance at services, participation in prayer meetings, and involvement in the charitable and educational work commonly undertaken by such congregations brought members into frequent and sustained contact in circumstances where personal reputation was closely guarded and closely watched. For a woman in Harriet Monckton's position, said to hold a position of some standing within the congregation and reportedly employed as a schoolmistress, the maintenance of an unblemished reputation would have carried particular weight, both for her own standing and for her livelihood. Against this background, the fact of her pregnancy, discovered only after her death, takes on a particular significance. An unmarried woman in Harriet Monckton's circumstances, within a religious community that placed considerable emphasis on personal conduct and moral standing, faced consequences for an unmarried pregnancy that extended well beyond personal embarrassment, potentially including the loss of employment, of standing within the congregation, and of the support of family and friends. The record does not establish how or from whom Harriet Monckton might have sought to conceal her condition, nor does it establish whether she had disclosed her circumstances to any member of her immediate circle prior to her death. What the record does establish is that the pregnancy, once discovered by medical examination, became inseparable from the subsequent inquiry into her death, since it supplied a possible motive without ever supplying a name. The investigation into Harriet Monckton's death was formally opened in the days immediately following the discovery of her body. Officers of the local constabulary were dispatched to the chapel premises, and the privy in which she had been found was examined for any physical evidence that might bear upon the circumstances of her death. Statements were taken from members of the congregation, from residents of the surrounding streets, and from those known to have been in contact with Harriet Monckton in the period leading up to her death. The investigation proceeded under the authority of the coroner for the district, whose office bore primary responsibility for establishing the cause and circumstances of a sudden or unexplained death of this kind. Early inquiries centred upon establishing Harriet Monckton's movements on the evening of 7 November, and upon identifying any person who might have had occasion to be in her company during the hours preceding her death. Members of the chapel congregation were asked to account for their own whereabouts that evening, a process that in due course brought the names of the Reverend George Verrill, Thomas Blackstone Churcher, Francis Williams, and Richard Field before the investigating authorities. Each was questioned in turn regarding the nature of their acquaintance with Harriet Monckton, the frequency and character of their contact with her, and their movements on the day in question. None of the statements taken from these four individuals, so far as the surviving record indicates, was found to establish with certainty the presence of any one of them at the scene at the material hour. The investigation also sought to establish the means by which the prussic acid that caused Harriet Monckton's death had come into her vicinity, or into the vicinity of the privy in which she died. Inquiries were made of local chemists and druggists within Bromley and the surrounding district in an effort to trace any recent purchase of the substance by a person connected to the case. The surviving record does not establish that any such purchase was traced to a named individual. Prussic acid, though a highly regulated substance, even in this period, owing to its extreme toxicity, was employed in small quantities for a variety of purposes, including certain medicinal preparations and the destruction of vermin, and its presence in a household or business premises would not, on its own, have been unusual enough to draw suspicion absent some further connecting evidence. No such connecting evidence, naming any one individual as having obtained or administered the poison, survives in the sources reviewed for this account. Investigators turn next to the question of Harriet Monckton's personal correspondence and any papers she might have left behind. Her lodgings were searched, and such letters and papers as she had kept were collected and examined. The contents of this material were subsequently referred to in the course of the inquest proceedings, though the surviving record does not permit a full reconstruction of what these papers contained. What can be stated is that the investigation regarded her personal correspondence as material to establishing the circumstances of her pregnancy and her relationships within the chapel community, and that this material was treated as evidence throughout the proceedings that followed. The investigating authorities also directed attention to the physical layout of the chapel grounds and the privy in which Harriet Monckton was found, in an effort to establish whether her presence there on the evening in question was consistent with her ordinary habits, or whether it indicated some other purpose. The chapel privy stood at a short distance from the main chapel building, within grounds that were accessible to members of the congregation in the ordinary course of chapel business, and its use by Harriet Monckton on the evening of her death was not, in itself, considered by investigators to be inherently irregular. What could not be established was any eyewitness account of her entering the privy, nor any account of another person following her there, nor any account of her leaving it alive. As the investigation proceeded through the closing weeks of 1843 and into the early months of 1844, the four named individuals continued to be questioned at intervals, and further statements were taken as new information came before the coroner's officers. The investigation did not at any point in the surviving record narrow to a single named suspect against whom sufficient evidence could be assembled to justify a formal charge. 3 of the 4 persons of interest continued to reside in or near Bromley during this period. Richard Field, however, had by this time married and moved to London, and the surviving record does not indicate that any of the 4 otherwise sought to evade the ongoing inquiries. The absence of a single identified suspect, combined with the gravity of the offence and the standing of the victim within her community, appears to have contributed to the unusually prolonged character of the proceedings that followed. Rather than concluding within the weeks typically allotted to a coroner's inquest of this period, the investigation into Harriet Monckton's death extended, through repeated adjournment and postponement, across a span of approximately 3 years. This is a highly irregular duration for proceedings of this kind, and the surviving record indicates that the coroner's office continued to receive and consider new statements and new lines of inquiry throughout this extended period, rather than treating the matter as closed after any single sitting. A post-mortem examination of Harriet Monckton's body was conducted in the days following her death. The examination established that death had resulted from the ingestion of prussic acid, a poison whose effects, once administered, proceed with great rapidity, producing unconsciousness and death typically within a matter of minutes. The examining physician further established, in the course of this examination, that Harriet Monckton had been approximately 6 months pregnant at the time of her death. The name of the physician who conducted this examination is not established with confidence in the sources reviewed for this account. The findings of the post-mortem examination were entered into the record and were subsequently placed before the coroner's inquest as the medical basis for the proceedings that followed. The post-mortem findings did not and could not establish who had administered the poison, or by what means it had come to be in Harriet Monckton's possession or within her reach. The examination confirmed the fact and manner of death, and confirmed the pregnancy, but left the question of agency entirely open. It was this combination of a clearly established cause of death, alongside a wholly unestablished attribution of responsibility, that was to characterise the entirety of the proceedings that followed, from the earliest days of the investigation through to the inquest's eventual and inconclusive verdict. The coroner's inquest into the death of Harriet Monckton was convened in Bromley in the weeks following her death, before a jury drawn from residents of the district, as was customary in proceedings of this kind. The inquest heard testimony regarding the discovery of the body, the findings of the post-mortem examination, and statements from those members of the chapel congregation and the surrounding community who could speak to Harriet Monckton's circumstances and acquaintances in the period preceding her death. The proceedings did not conclude within a single sitting. Owing to the volume of testimony under consideration and to the continuing uncertainty as to the identity of any responsible party, the inquest was adjourned, to be resumed at a later date. A second sitting of the inquest was held some time afterward at the Swan and Mitre, a public house in Bromley, a venue not uncommon for coronial proceedings of this period, which were frequently conducted in the largest available room of a local inn in the absence of a purpose-built courtroom. At this second sitting, further testimony was heard, including additional statements from those persons who had been named earlier in the investigation. The proceedings continued to be marked by the same difficulty that had attended the case from its outset, namely, the absence of any evidence sufficient to identify a single individual as responsible for Harriet Monckton's death. The proceedings before the coroner's jury also gave attention to the character and conduct of Harriet Monckton in the months preceding her death, as testimony was heard from members of the congregation regarding her habits of attendance, her demeanour within the chapel community, and her known associations. This testimony was received and entered into the record, though it did not, in itself, resolve the central question before the jury. Witnesses were asked to account for their knowledge of Harriet Monckton's circumstances and to describe, so far as they were able, any indication that she had confided in them regarding her condition or her intentions. The surviving record indicates that such testimony varied considerably in its detail and did not converge upon any single, consistent account. The coroner presiding over the inquest was known, according to sources reviewed for this account, to have formed his own private view as to the likely responsibility for Harriet Monckton's death, a view that he did not commit to the formal record, and that was never substantiated by evidence sufficient to support a charge. This detail that an official, closely acquainted with the full body of testimony, believed he understood the truth of the matter, yet lacked the proof required to act upon that belief, is itself a part of the surviving record of the case, distinct from the jury's own formal findings. The coroner's private conviction, whatever its basis, was not entered into evidence, was never tested before a court, and cannot be treated in this account as anything more than what the record establishes it to be, namely an unproven private opinion. The jury, for its part, deliberated upon the whole of the testimony placed before it across the several sittings of the inquest, testimony that spanned not weeks but years, as the proceedings were repeatedly adjourned to allow for further inquiry and the collection of additional statements. Such a prolonged inquest was itself a matter of note within the district, since coronial proceedings of this period were ordinarily expected to conclude within a comparatively short interval of the death under investigation. The repeated adjournments in the Monckton case reflected the jury's evident reluctance to return a verdict naming any individual without evidence they regarded as sufficient to support such a finding. At the conclusion of this protracted process, extending across a period of approximately 3 years from the date of Harriet Monckton's death, the jury returned its verdict. The verdict was one of willful murder by person or persons unknown. In the plain terms of the finding, the jury concluded that Harriet Monckton had been killed, and that her death was not the result of accident or her own act, but the jury was unable to identify or unwilling to name without sufficient proof any specific individual as responsible for administering the poison that caused her death. This verdict closed the formal inquest proceedings without resolving the question of agency that had occupied the investigation from its earliest days. No individual was ever committed for trial in connection with Harriet Monckton's death. The case did not proceed to the assizes nor to any sitting of a criminal court, since no evidence had been assembled during the course of the investigation, and the inquest sufficient to support a formal charge against any of the persons who had been named and questioned. The Reverend George Verrill, Thomas Blackstone Churcher, Francis Williams, and Richard Field each remained at the conclusion of the inquest, formally unaccused of any offence, their earlier status as persons of interest never converted into any legal charge. The record indicates that official correspondence concerning the case exchanged among a coroner's juror, the Kent County coroner, and officials of higher authority continued for some time after the inquest's conclusion, a further indication that the matter was not regarded, even by those who had presided over it, as satisfactorily closed. The absence of any prosecution meant that Harriet Monckton's case did not generate the kind of published trial record that survives for many contemporaneous killings, since no barrister argued the matter before a judge, and no formal transcript of courtroom proceedings was ever produced. What survives instead is the documentation generated by the inquest itself, together with the National Archives file containing the subsequent official correspondence, and it is this body of material, rather than any courtroom record, that has formed the basis for the case's later examination. The case retained a measure of local memory within Bromley and the surrounding district in the years following the inquest's conclusion, preserved chiefly through parish and local records, rather than through any wider national reporting of the kind that attended more prominent criminal cases of the period. It was not until considerably later that the case attracted renewed attention beyond the immediate district. The novelist Elizabeth Haynes, drawing upon the original coroner's reports and surviving witness testimony held within the National Archives, published a full-length work of fiction based upon the case in 2018 under the title The Murder of Harriet Monckton. The work drew favourable notice from reviewers and readers with an interest in cases of this kind, and its publication brought the case to an audience considerably wider than the local historians and genealogical researchers who had previously constituted its principal audience. As a work of fiction, the novel necessarily supplied dramatised detail beyond what the surviving documentary record establishes, and only the factual scaffolding common to the historical accounts. The names, the roles, the verdict, and the broad timeline of events can properly be treated as established fact rather than novelistic invention. The social world in which Harriet Monckton's death occurred was one shaped by the particular conditions of nonconformist religious life in early Victorian England. Congregationalist chapels of this period operated outside the structures of the established church, governed by their own ministers and lay committees, and drawing their membership from tradespeople, artisans, and shopkeepers, who found in such congregations both spiritual community and social standing. Membership in a chapel of this kind carried with it an expectation of visible moral conduct, since the congregation functioned not only as a place of worship, but as a network of mutual acquaintance in which personal reputation was subject to continual, if largely unspoken, observation. For a woman such as Harriet Monckton, said to hold standing within her congregation and to have worked in the instruction of children, this expectation would have borne with particular weight upon her circumstances during the final months of her life. The stigma attached to an unmarried woman's pregnancy in a community of this character was considerable, extending beyond personal embarrassment to the potential loss of employment, of standing within the congregation, and of the support of family and community alike. It is against this social background that the four individuals named during the course of the investigation, the minister, the shoemaker, the schoolmistress, and the former suitor, must be understood, since each occupied a defined position within the same closely bound community, and each was drawn into an inquiry that ultimately failed to establish which among them, if any, bore responsibility for what had occurred. The surviving record does not indicate that any one of the four ever departed markedly from this position of unresolved suspicion, nor does it indicate that public opinion within the district ever settled decisively upon one individual over the others. The chapel itself, a modest brick structure fronting one of Bromley's principal streets, continued to hold its regular services throughout the period in which the investigation remained open, and the congregation that gathered there each week did so in the knowledge that one of its own members had died within the grounds under circumstances that no verdict had resolved. The privy behind the chapel, an outbuilding of plain construction, standing apart from the main structure, as was customary for such premises in this period, remained in ordinary use by the congregation. Throughout these years, its continued presence within the chapel grounds, a standing and unavoidable reminder of the events of November 1843 to any member of the congregation who passed it in the course of attending to the chapel's affairs. The 3 years across which the inquest proceedings extended saw the ordinary business of the town continue around the unresolved case. Markets were held on their accustomed days, the coaching trade along the Tunbridge Road continued its regular passage through the town, and the chapel's own calendar of services, prayer meetings, and instructional classes proceeded largely as before. Yet the case remained throughout this period a matter of continuing interest and unease within the congregation and the wider town, since the 4 individuals named in connection with the investigation continued to reside within or near Bromley, continued in several instances to be seen about the town in the ordinary course of their trades, and continued to be regarded, rightly or wrongly, as men and women who might yet be shown to bear some responsibility for what had occurred. The National Archives file that preserves the record of this case includes correspondence exchanged well beyond the conclusion of the inquest itself, passing between a member of the coroner's jury, the coroner for the county of Kent, and officials of higher standing within the administration of justice. The survival of this correspondence indicates that the case continued to be regarded by at least some of those who had been closely involved in its investigation as a matter warranting further attention even after the jury had returned its verdict of willful murder by persons unknown. The precise content and full extent of this correspondence is not detailed with complete clarity in the sources reviewed for this account, but its existence, spanning a period of years after the formal proceedings had concluded, stands as evidence that the case was never treated by those closest to it as a matter fully and finally closed. Thomas Blackstone Churcher remained in Bromley for a time, following the inquest, pursuing his trade as a shoemaker, and at intervals his additional work collecting debts owed to local tradesmen, before later relocating to Sydenham, where he died in 1876. Local historical research undertaken in connection with the Friends of Brockley and Ladywell cemeteries has traced elements of his later life within the town, describing him as a man who continued in his trade and remained a known figure within the community for the remainder of his years, without the surviving record indicating that he ever spoke publicly of the events of 1843 or of his own connection to the case. He is buried, according to this later research, in the Brockley and Ladywell area rather than in Bromley itself, his grave one among the many that this research group has worked to document and preserve as part of its broader effort to record the lives of ordinary residents connected to notable events in the local history of the area. Of Francis Williams and Richard Field, considerably less can be established from the surviving record. Neither appears to have left behind papers, correspondence, or a documented later history sufficient to permit any account of their lives beyond the years in which they were named in connection with the investigation into Harriet Monckton's death. Whether either remained in Bromley, married, or departed the district entirely is not established by the sources reviewed for this account, and no such claim is offered here. This absence of further record is itself consistent with the broader pattern of the case, in which so much that might have clarified the circumstances of Harriet Monckton's death, the identity of the father of her child, the precise sequence of her final hours, and the ultimate responsibility for the poison that killed her, simply does not survive, and cannot be supplied by inference or speculation. The 4 individuals named during the course of the investigation were never, in the whole course of the surviving record, distinguished from one another by any finding of the coroner's jury or by any subsequent legal proceeding. The Reverend George Verrill continued in his ministry for years afterward. Thomas Blackstone Churcher continued in his trade before later relocating from the town in which the case had unfolded. Francis Williams and Richard Field passed from the documented record altogether. Each remained, to the end of the surviving files, a person of interest and nothing more, their names preserved in the National Archives, not as the names of the guilty, but as the names of those who could not be excluded, and equally could not be convicted, by the evidence that the investigation and the inquest were able to gather across 3 years of inquiry. The identification of prussic acid as the cause of death relied, in the medical practice of this period, upon a characteristic that distinguished it from most other poisons available to a physician's examination. The substance produced, upon exposure, a distinctive odour resembling that of bitter almonds, a feature well known to physicians and toxicologists of the early Victorian period, and frequently cited in medical literature of the time as the principal means by which its presence could be detected at the scene of a death or upon examination of the body. It was this characteristic, together with the rapidity of the collapse it produced and the absence of other evident cause, that guided the examining physician toward the conclusion ultimately entered into the post-mortem record. The speed with which prussic acid acted, producing unconsciousness within moments of ingestion and death shortly thereafter, left little opportunity for the persons in the vicinity of the chapel that evening to summon assistance, a circumstance that the investigation was obliged to take into account in assessing why no alarm appears to have been raised before Harriet Monckton was already beyond help. The constabulary's initial response to the discovery of the body followed the established practice of the period for a sudden and unexplained death occurring on premises open to public or semi-public use. An officer was summoned to secure the scene, to prevent disturbance of the body and its immediate surroundings pending the arrival of the coroner's officer, and to begin the process of identifying and interviewing those persons who might have information bearing upon the circumstances of the death. The coroner, upon being notified, exercised his statutory authority to summon a jury from among the resident householders of the district, a jury whose composition, drawn as it customarily was from tradesmen, shopkeepers, and other men of standing within the community, would in this instance have included individuals personally acquainted, in the ordinary course of a small town's affairs, with several of those named as persons of interest in the proceedings that followed. This overlap between the community from which the jury was drawn and the community in which the 4 named individuals lived and worked was not unusual for coronial proceedings conducted in a town of Bromley's size during this period, where the pool of eligible jurors was necessarily limited and a degree of prior acquaintance between jurors and witnesses could scarcely be avoided. It does, however, help to account for the caution with which the jury appears to have approached its eventual verdict, returning a finding that acknowledged the fact of murder without naming any individual, rather than proceeding upon inference or local suspicion. In the absence of evidence the jurors regarded as sufficient to support a formal accusation against a neighbour, a fellow tradesman, or, in the case of the Reverend Verrill, their own minister. Within the congregation itself, the discovery of Harriet Monckton's death and the subsequent revelation of her pregnancy produced a period of evident disquiet that extended through the years in which the inquest remained open. Attendance at the chapel's services and meetings continued throughout this period, but the surviving record indicates that the congregation's ordinary life was conducted under the shadow of an unresolved question that touched several of its own most familiar members. The minister who continued to lead its worship, the shoemaker who continued to occupy his accustomed place among its congregants, and the friend who continued, so far as the record permits any account of her, to move within the same small circle of acquaintance did so as individuals whose position within the community had been altered irrevocably by their association with a case that no verdict had resolved and no subsequent inquiry ever reopened with sufficient evidence to reach a different conclusion. Reporting of the case within the local press of Kent during this period, so far as it survives, followed the extended course of the inquest itself, with notices appearing at intervals to record each adjournment and each renewed sitting of the coroner's jury. Such reporting, characteristic of provincial newspapers of the period, tended toward brief and factual notice of proceedings rather than extended narrative, recording the date of a sitting, the substance of testimony heard, and the fact of any further adjournment without venturing into speculation as to the identity of the person responsible. This pattern of restrained procedural notice, repeated across the several years in which the case remained open, meant that Harriet Monckton's name and the bare facts of her case were kept before the reading public of the district at intervals for a considerably longer period than was typical for a case of this kind, even as the detail supplied in each notice remained largely unchanged from one sitting to the next. The letters and papers recovered from Harriet Monckton's lodgings, once entered into the proceedings, were treated by the inquest chiefly as evidence bearing upon her personal relationships within the chapel community, rather than as evidence bearing directly upon the mechanics of her death. Testimony concerning the content of this correspondence touched upon her acquaintance with the men and the friend later named as persons of interest, though the surviving record does not permit a reconstruction of the letters' precise wording or their full content. What can be said is that this correspondence formed part of the body of evidence considered by the jury in reaching its eventual verdict, and that its introduction into the proceedings reflects the extent to which the investigation depended upon personal testimony and private papers, in the near total absence of physical evidence connecting any one individual to the administration of the poison itself. The physical setting in which Harriet Monckton died on the evening of the 7th of November would have been marked by the particular character of a Kentish autumn well advanced toward winter, with the early darkness of the season already established by the customary hour of evening chapel activities, and the grounds behind the chapel likely affording little illumination beyond what might be carried by hand from the chapel building itself. The privy stood, as such structures customarily did, at a modest remove from the main building, reached by a path across the chapel yard, a setting in which a person's presence or absence might pass unremarked by others engaged in the ordinary business of an evening meeting held within the chapel itself. This ordinary obscurity of the setting, unremarkable in itself, became, in the course of the investigation that followed, a circumstance that made the reconstruction of Harriet Monckton's final movements considerably more difficult than it might otherwise have been. The verdict of wilful murder by person or persons unknown carried a specific and limited legal meaning within the practice of English coronial law during this period. It represented a formal finding that a criminal act had occurred, rather than an accident, a suicide, or death by natural causes, while stopping short of naming any individual as the perpetrator of that act. Such a verdict did not close the matter in the same manner as an acquittal following a full criminal trial, since no individual had been formally tried and found not guilty. Rather, it left the case technically open to future prosecution, should evidence subsequently come to light sufficient to identify and charge a responsible party. No such evidence was ever presented in the years that followed, and no prosecution was ever brought. But the legal status of the case remained, in principle, unresolved rather than concluded, a distinction reflected in the continuing correspondence preserved within the National Archives file long after the jury had delivered its finding. The congregation of the Bromley Independent Chapel, at the time these events unfolded, numbered among its regular members a body of persons drawn predominantly from the tradesmen, shopkeepers, and artisan families of the town and its immediate vicinity, a congregation of the scale typical for a nonconformist chapel serving a market town of Bromley's size in this period, sufficient to sustain a settled minister, regular weekly services, and the range of prayer meetings and instructional classes characteristic of Congregationalist practice. Within a body of this size, the personal acquaintance between Harriet Monckton, the minister who led its worship, the shoemaker who attended its services, and the friend who shared her occupation as a schoolmistress, would have been not merely possible but, in the ordinary course of chapel life, difficult to avoid, since the round of weekly and midweek meetings brought the same limited number of persons into regular and repeated contact with one another across the course of any given year. Persons named as of interest during the course of the inquest were permitted, under the practice of the period, to engage a solicitor to attend the proceedings on their behalf, to hear the testimony given, and within the limits allowed by the coroner presiding, to put questions to witnesses whose statements touched upon their own conduct or reputation. The surviving record does not establish with certainty which, if any, of the four individuals named in the Monckton case availed themselves of such representation during the several sittings of the inquest, though the practice was sufficiently established by this period that its use would not have been remarkable. Legal representation at an inquest of this kind differed considerably from representation at a criminal trial, since the coroner's proceeding was an inquiry into the fact and manner of death, rather than an adversarial contest between prosecution and defence, and a solicitor's role within it was correspondingly more limited, confined chiefly to protecting his client's reputation against damaging testimony rather than to mounting any formal defence against a charge that had not, in any case, been laid. The file that eventually came to rest within the National Archives, comprising the inquest depositions, the post-mortem findings, and the later correspondence among the coroner's juror, the county coroner, and higher officials, remained for more than a century. Thereafter a document consulted chiefly by those with a specific occasion to examine it, rather than a case widely known beyond the district in which it had occurred. Its transfer into the permanent custody of the National Record ensured its physical survival, even as the case itself receded from the general memory of the country at large, preserved principally within the more localised traditions of Bromley itself and within the records maintained by those engaged in the genealogical and historical study of the town and its inhabitants. It was this file, dormant for generations within the archive, that later research was to draw upon in reconstructing the case for a modern readership, work that depended entirely upon the depositions and correspondence that had been carefully preserved, despite the case's want of any resolution at the time it was first recorded. The gossip and speculation that circulated through Bromley's market days in the years following Harriet Monckton's death formed, according to the traditions preserved locally, a persistent undercurrent to the town's ordinary commerce, as stallholders, tradesmen, and their customers exchanged rumour and supposition regarding the case each time the inquest was reported to have resumed. Such speculation, unlike the formal testimony entered into the coronial record, was never reduced to writing in a form that survives for examination today, and no historian working from the documentary record can properly attribute any specific rumour or supposition to a named resident of the town. What can be said is that the case, by virtue of its unusual duration and its connection to a respected local congregation, occupied a place in the town's collective attention that few other local events of this period achieved, a prominence attested to by the persistence of local memory regarding the case long after the file itself had passed into official, archival custody and out of everyday circulation. The chapel congregation itself, meeting week upon week through the several years the inquest remained open, provided the setting in which this local attention was most keenly felt, since it was here that Harriet Monckton had been known personally, and it was from among its own members that 3 of the 4 persons of interest were drawn. A congregation of tradesmen and shopkeepers gathered for worship and instruction under the continued ministry of a man whose own name had been raised in connection with the case, cannot be supposed to have set the matter wholly aside in the course of its ordinary religious observance. Though the surviving record offers no direct testimony as to how the congregation's collective life was affected by the continuing uncertainty, it is sufficient to record that the chapel continued its services throughout this period without interruption, and that no account survives of any member's departure from the congregation on account of the unresolved case. Harriet Monckton's burial followed her death within the customary interval, observed for a death investigated by the coroner, once the initial post-mortem examination and the first sitting of the inquest had been completed sufficiently to permit release of the body for interment. The precise location of her grave within Bromley is not established with confidence in the sources reviewed for this account, and no description survives of any headstone or memorial marking the site in a manner that has been preserved into later local record. This absence of a documented gravesite stands in contrast to the survival of Thomas Blackstone Church's own burial location within the later research conducted on his life, and it means that Harriet Monckton herself, the subject at the centre of the entire 3-year proceeding, occupies a less certain place within the physical landscape of the town than several of those who are merely named in connection with her death. Her memory survives, in consequence, chiefly through the documentary record of the inquest and the National Archives file, rather than through any monument raised in the town itself. The child she carried at the time of her death did not survive her. No separate inquiry into the child is recorded in the sources reviewed for this account, the post-mortem findings having addressed the pregnancy solely as a medical fact bearing upon the circumstances of the mother's death, rather than as a separate matter requiring its own examination. This too was consistent with the medical and coronial practice of the period, in which an unborn child was not treated as a subject of inquiry distinct from the body in which it was carried, and no further proceeding concerning the pregnancy was undertaken beyond its documentation within the post-mortem record placed before the coroner's jury. The case of Harriet Monckton was the last of these 3 cases to enter the historical record. No arrest was ever made. The investigation was formally closed. The case remains open. The record remains incomplete.